Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on the first part of Dreaming in Cuban. Starting with some information about the author, Cristina Garcia, a Cuban-born American novelist and journalist. Dreaming in Cuban was her first novel and was a finalist for a National Book Award. She has published 8 novels, including Dreaming in Cuban, The Agüero Sisters, and Monkey Hunting. Her next novel is slated to be published in 2023, that's supposed to say 2023, Vanishing Map, which is a continuation of the Dreaming in Cuban story. The novel takes place between Cuba and New York City, and it documents the impact of the Cuban Revolution on Cubans on the island and those who migrated following the island. The main characters span 3 generations of Filipino women: Celia, who remains in Cuba; Lourdes, who migrates to New York City after the revolution; and Pilar, who grows up and comes of age in New York City. Now, to understand the historical context of the novel and why these characters relate to Cuba in the ways that they do, I wanted in this lecture to give you a little bit of historical context so that you can kind of understand the bigger picture here. So the first wave of the post-Castro immigration of Cubans included political elites who were fleeing Castro's government. So Castro takes over in 1959. And those that had been against him, who were more of the wealthy elite, were pro-US and were more conservative in their politics. Those were the first to flee once Castro's government takes over. There were also professionals and politicians who benefited from the prior regime and who were also pro-American. Those also were part of this first population to leave. It also included the upper middle class that became disillusioned with the revolution. They were actually members of this class at the beginning, were in favor of the ideals of the revolution and what the revolution represented. But as the government of Castro took over and the realities became visible, many folks from this particular class also became disillusioned and decided to leave. And there were many of these who left who had accumulated wealth in the United States. Many of the members of this upper class were people who were used to traveling, especially between Miami and Cuba. They had already estates in Miami. They held a lot of their wealth in banks in Miami. So when they left, they thought that they could come to the United States, particularly South Florida, and kind of wait the revolution out, right? There was sort of this sense that there was no way the US was going to allow Castro to stay in government for very long, and that all they needed to do was to wait it out and they'd be able to return to the island. Now, many of these folks, once they left, the Castro government was aware that they were leaving, never to return, but he didn't mind because he wanted the quote-unquote gusanos, or worms, as he called them, which he considered anti-revolutionary, out of the country, since they could potentially undermine his efforts. So in essence, a lot of the people who could have toppled his government from within the island had left in this wave. Now, many of these folks, once they came to the United States, didn't see themselves as immigrants, as other people from different Latin American countries who have come to the United States have seen themselves as. They identified themselves specifically as political exiles. They came to the United States because of political reasons and really defined themselves as political exiles. As I said, Cuba labeled this population as gusanos, as a way to sort of undermine them, and particularly to the Cuban population that remained, as people who were traitors and had abandoned the revolution. Property in Cuba was confiscated if they didn't return by a certain date, and those with technical skills and of military age were denied access. So there was some control in terms of who was allowed to leave. And for this upper class, lost a lot of the wealth, including assets like property that they held in Cuba, if they didn't return by a certain date. So they were warned by the Castro administration that if they didn't return, that the government was essentially going to confiscate their property and either use it for government purposes or redistribute this property to landless people in the island. Now, that first wave, once they come to the United States, a number of them do experience downward mobility for some professionals, particularly people like doctors and lawyers who weren't licensed to practice in the United States until they were able to achieve those licenses. Again, to practice here, they had to take whatever jobs were available to them. So they did experience some downward mobility. Women found employment in the expanding garment industry. This meant that for the first time, middle-class educated Cuban women who did not work outside of the home in Cuba now all of a sudden found themselves not only needing to work, but also to work in factories. They also represented a competition for African-American laborers, particularly because so many of this population came to Southern Florida, especially to Miami, where the African-American community had been experiencing economic recession. And so once this large new population comes in of workers, they represent a competition for African-Americans. You also start seeing signs and some resentment from the local American population, seeing signs that said no Cubans allowed in local establishments. They also often had difficulties in renting apartments and so on because people were resistant to this population coming into Miami at this time. Now, of course, the government of the United States is at first taking a very passive kind of response to this population arriving. President Eisenhower's administration assumed that this was going to be temporary and didn't want to invest in the community. Political pressures do result in the creation of the Cuban Refugee Emergency Center in 1960 to provide some assistance in helping these folks settle and navigate sort of the bureaucracies of the United States, particularly for those that were coming without any family connections in the United States. The official policy was do not assimilate them. So again, contrary to the prevalent attitude for all immigrants when they come to the United States, which is usually get them to assimilate as quickly as possible, the policy was to not assimilate this particular population because the US government also believed that the Castro administration was not going to last very long and that this population was going to be returning. So this was the reason why the government didn't feel not only a sense of not investing in assimilating, but also not investing funds into this particular population. This, however, begins to change when it becomes clearer as the years pass that this population is still here and Castro is still in power. President Kennedy creates the Cuban Refugee Program in 1961, which provided funds not just for resettlement throughout other parts of the United States, but also for relief checks, health, education, job training. They actually received more money in their relief checks than the local population did. So that also contributed to some tensions between the local population and this new arriving group. Federal fundings also went to programs to expedite the licensure of Cuban professionals, like doctors and lawyers, for example, so that they could practice and work in the United States. Low-interest loans were also made available for college. By 1966, the program had assisted more than 5,500 students to attend college. The University of Miami and the University of Florida created in 1973 intensive 18-month programs that assisted Cuban lawyers in achieving American law degrees. So, and the reason that this population in particular is being assisted is because they were fleeing communism. but also because the United States felt that if they invested in this population, that again, once they returned, because that was still an expectation, that there would be a cadre of people there who had been educated by the United States, that had been helped by the United States, and therefore would have a pro-American kind of attitude. The second wave of immigrants come through what are known as the freedom flights between 1965 and 1973, when Castro announced that Cubans with relatives in the United States were free to leave the island. Immediately, Cubans rented boats to go pick up their loved ones in Cuba, even though the United States government tried to discourage people from going on their own because of the dangers of the seas, but also to try to control immigration. Priority. So the Johnson administration responds by creating this accord with Cuba, resulting in the freedom flights. The priority was given to those who had already had families in the United States, which fit with the recently passed Immigration Act of 1965 that emphasized family reunification as a purpose for accepting new immigrants. This also impacted the racial makeup of the second wave, since the majority of those who were already in Miami were predominantly light-skinned, white, and middle-class Cuban Americans. This excluded from the agreement were political prisoners, young men of military age, and those with technical skills. So because of the family reunification part of the agreement, many of the people who came with the freedom flights, in addition to being predominantly white, were also women and the elderly. It also consisted of some Cuban Jews, Chinese Cubans, and yet Black Cubans were underrepresented. Those were the ones who particularly remained behind because this was the population that was primarily supported by the revolution, right? Some of the promises of the revolution was not only that it would equalize class differences, but that it was also going to do away with racial discrimination, and that Black Cubans in particular were going to be treated more fairly, and would benefit from the revolution. The response in the United States, particularly in Miami, to the second wave was still some resistance, particularly by the African-American community. In some newspapers, you saw complaints and comments such as, "We are up to our armpits with Cuban refugees." But services continued to be provided. Assistance programs were created, which offered these kinds of assistance. There was a training for independence program, which targeted women workers in particular. Bilingual education was implemented in schools to help the children of Cubans to settle into the educational system. The Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966 allowed Cubans to more quickly change their immigration status to permanent residents or citizens. It cut all of the usual red tape that Cubans had to go through before gaining permanent status. This was, again, to help professionals expedite their licensures, but also to help the elderly that were coming through this wave to be able to qualify for benefits such as Medicare. The no assimilation policy shifts toward trying to get them to establish psychological ties to the United States. But as we will see in the novel, this doesn't exactly happen for those that leave during this time period from the island. So in essence, what you have is this creation of a particular type of Cuban culture in the United States, where Cuban identities, both cultural and political. They're maintaining a sense of what is called the Cuba de ayer, the Cuba of yesterday, where they uphold a lot of the traditions and customs that they had to leave behind. They're creating cultural and educational institutions from Cuba. A lot of the schools, private schools that existed in Cuba are reopened in exile in Miami. and many of the children of the Cuban upper middle class attend these particular schools. And they're also very invested in upholding language and culture, again, because no matter how many years pass of this population being in the United States, there is still this sense that there will be an eventual return. And so it's important to pass the language and culture on to the next generation. So this ends the lecture for this week. This gives you at least some bigger context to understand what is happening in the novel, especially when it comes to Cuban politics and the different feeling towards Cuba that you see among the various characters in the novel. So this ends the lecture for this week. I look forward to seeing your comments in the discussion posts about the first part of Dreaming in Cuban. Have a good week.